Hello everyone, welcome to Code and Learn. So in the last video, we added code for the post news handler func, and then we also added tests for it. I asked you to have a go at coding the other handler func and also maybe trying to write tests for it. So in this video, I will just share the results of how I wrote the handler func and the test cases. Your code could be different. That's fine as long as it's working as we expect. So first let us look at the get all news handler. In this case, what we are doing is just receiving the request and then looking for all the news in our store. If we get an error, we are returning an internal server error. Then here we have defined a new response body, that is all news response, which only has one field, which is a array of news object or news post request body. So we set that up and then write our response back to our response writer. And if we fail, we just log the error and say internal server error. Now in getNewsID, we need to fetch the ID from the incoming request or the incoming request path. For that, we are using path value. Path value returns the value for the name path wildcard that match the request. So if you notice, in our router, we are using news_id as our path or the path matching parameter. So here we are doing news ID. We get the news ID as a string. Now the news ID needs to be a UUID. To validate that, we are doing uuid.parse, which is a function exported by the UUID package. And if there's error, we are logging the error. Otherwise, we are using that news UUID to find the news by its ID. If there's an error, we return status internal server error. Otherwise, we use that news to write the response back. We don't need to define a new response body because the news we get is already of type news post request body, which has the JSON tags to encode it. Then we have the update news by ID. In this case, we do a similar process as to post request handler. We first decode the request body, then perform a validation. If everything works out, we update the news by its ID. The ID in this case will be provided by the news request post body itself. You could have the ID in the path as well, but that's up to you how you want to define where we want to get the ID from. My thinking behind this is because I don't want to duplicate the news request body in two places. Finally, we have the delete news by ID. In this case, we are doing a similar thing, getting the news ID from the path, parsing it as a UUID. If we fail, we say the news ID is not a valid UUID. If it's valid, we perform the delete operation. If the delete operation fails, we write the internal server error back to the response. Otherwise, we just say no content, which is a very common response to a delete request. So that's all our handlers. Now let us look at the handler tests. So that's our post news test. Now let us look at the get news test. In this case, we only evaluate two test cases. One, when there is a DB error, for which we set the error state to true, and we expect the status to be internal server error. And then the success case, when there's no DB error, and we expect status OK, return to the response. Inside the test itself, we are doing something very similar to what we have in post news test. Now for get news by ID, we need to provide ID in the request path. For that, we are using set path value on the request, providing in the wildcard and the news ID, which comes from the test case. First case is when we have an invalid news ID. For that, we are just using an invalid UUID string. So we expect a bad request return. Then we have a DB error for which we set the state to true. Notice, in this case, we are using the function uuid.newString to get a valid UUID. Then we have the success case where we are doing a similar thing, but this time the UUID is valid and the database doesn't throw an error. So that's an additional step that we did here. That is adding the news ID or news_ID to the request so that it can be parsed here. Then we have the test for update news by ID. Similar to what we did earlier, we have a invalid request JSON body where we're just providing the opening curly braces, which amounts to a invalid JSON. And then we expect a status bad request. Then we have the invalid request where we expect a bad request. In here, we are missing the tags, which should make the validation to fail. Then we have the DB error, similar to what we did in post news. Then finally we have the success. Here too, we are doing a similar thing. Finally, we have the test for delete news by ID. First case is invalid news ID, then DB error, and then success. Again, we are adding a news ID via the test cases using request.setPathValue. So that is how our handler setup is now looking along with the test cases. One thing you need to do is pass the news store instance in here in the router to all the functions that return our handler func. But here, if you see, we are returning nil. So if you run the code or the server and try to make a request, the request will fail with a panic because we are trying to access a method on a nil instance of news storer. So this is something that we will tackle in the next video by creating a in-memory store. Again, if you have any problems, please post a comment under the video or reach out to our Discord server. One thing to keep in mind is, when going through the video, pause and try to look at the code and try to see if you can find the problem yourself. Otherwise, as I said, reach out to me. So, until next time, happy coding.